Well, there's several movies that are made with this kind of idea or this theme, and they're usually comedies. But basically what it is it's a story goes where there's someone who is kind of inept. They don't really know what they're doing. They're not really able to do what they're supposed to be doing. And there's another person who kind of follows them around and fixes all the problems without their knowledge. For example, I remember there was one where a guy kind of stumbled into a situation where there was some espionage going on. And so there were spies and things happening, and the guy stumbled into the situation, and then the real spies recruited him, because he was in the mix, recruited him to be a spy. Well, the guy didn't really know what he was doing, and he kind of fumbled his way through everything, and he thought he was doing everything great, but really he wasn't. He was making a mess of things. He thinks he has everything under control, but meanwhile, the real spy is working behind the scenes, kind of following him around, fixing the problems, working in the background, taking all the hits, making everything actually work. And there's usually a lot of comedy involved in that. Probably because it's not real. If it was real, it wouldn't be very funny. But the first guy just goes through incident after incident thinking he's doing everything just right. Thinking that everything just worked out. Well, this, in a way, I'm stretching a little bit, but in a way, is kind of like us and God. Not that we are totally inept, but sometimes we can be. And not that God is just following us around fixing our messes or making everything good for us, but God is working. He's always there. He's always working. So in situations that we find ourselves, God is working. Through other people and through us, God is working. Often, in spite of what we do, God is working. And maybe in spite of what other people do, God is working. When things look good and when things look bad, God is working. So I've said that several times. You're catching it, right? God is working all around us, in our lives and in our world. And ultimately, He's working for His glory. As we look at 2 Samuel today, we're going to see this. God has a plan, and He's making it happen. God is working. Even with the treason of sinful men, the sinful plans of men, the impossible and bad situations that they will find themselves in, God is working. God hasn't abandoned His people and left them on their own because He's working. And even while He's disciplining David, God is still with him and is still helping him and still supporting him because God is working. And the same is true for us today. Your situation and David's situation may be very different, but God is the same. And God is working. So let's remember where we were here. David's son Absalom is leading a revolt against David. He wants to be king, and David has gone on the run. David is now in a difficult and dangerous position, but he is trusting God. Now, he's also willing to accept whatever it is that God wants to do in his life. And so if God is going to discipline him, David's okay with that. If God is going to take the kingdom away from him, David's okay with that. If God is going to restore David to continue being the king, David is okay with that. He's okay with whatever God wants to do in his life. At the same time, David has made some wise decisions and has taken action in order to be successful at becoming or remaining king, if that's what God so chooses to do, if that's what God wills. Now, Absalom seems to have the upper hand, and David has gone on the run. He has many supporters, and including the great advisor Ahithophel. Ahithophel was an advisor to David, and now he's advising Absalom. In fact, when David heard that Ahithophel was helping Absalom, remember what David did? He immediately prayed because he recognized the great strength that brought to Absalom. He immediately prayed to God and asked him to help him. He asked him to turn the wisdom of Ahithophel into foolishness. And David and those who are with him have been running. They're exhausted, and they've reached the Jordan River, and they're waiting there on the side of the Jordan River, waiting for news of what is happening, what's going on, and some direction of what they should do. So this is where we pick up the story in chapter 16 and verse 15. It says, "Now Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. And when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, Hushai said to Absalom, 'Long live the king, long live the king.' And Absalom also said to Hushai, 'Is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend?' Now we know he did try to go with David, and David sent him back. He said, 'Go back to Jerusalem.' And Hushai said to Absalom, 'No, for whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. And again, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son? As I have served your father, so I will serve you.'" So now Absalom is in Jerusalem. He has taken the palace, and we're specifically told that Ahithophel is with him. Now this is an ominous note for David and his supporters, because we're reminded that Absalom has this great help. But then right away, we also hear about Hushai showing up. Now Hushai was David's friend and advisor, who David had said, "Go back." So he's loyal to David, but he's offering his service to Absalom the way David told him to do it. You see, Hushai is going back in order to infiltrate and misadvise. So if Ahithophel advises this way, we can advise the other way to help David. But the conversation that Hushai and Absalom have is very interesting. Hushai is purposely ambiguous in what he says. The way he talks, he doesn't use any names, you'll notice. So Absalom, in his vanity and in his ambition to be king, accepts everything as if Hushai is totally in support of him. So Hushai makes these statements that could be understood in two ways. He remains perfectly loyal to David, but Absalom hears it as loyalty to him. So, for example, the first thing he says is, "Long live the king." He says it twice. Which king? He doesn't say, "Long live King Absalom." He simply says, "Long live the king." However, he's saying it in Absalom's presence, so Absalom assumes he's talking about me. I think he's talking about David, because David is the king. So he says, "Long live the king." Now, Absalom hears this, though, and he's a little critical about Hushai, and he seems like he might be a little skeptical, a little suspicious, because he accuses him of disloyalty. Is this the way you treat your friend? But Hushai's answer begins with the word no. So are you being disloyal? His answer is no. I'm not being disloyal. Now this is actually true. He is not being disloyal to David. But the rest of his answer would suggest that supporting Absalom is not being disloyal to David as well. And so he goes on, and at least this is the way Absalom hears it. So in verse 18, look what he says. In verse 18, he said, and Hushai said to Absalom, "No, for whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain." So he says, I will be loyal to this person. Now, who is the person? The person that all the people and the Lord have chosen. Now, there are some men in Israel who have chosen Absalom to be their king at this point. They are revolting against David, and they say, we want Absalom to be king. But who has God chosen to be king? David. There is absolutely nothing that would suggest God has chosen Absalom. But we have seen over and over again that God chose David. So you see the kind of way Hushai is speaking here? He says, the one who the Lord has chosen, I will be loyal to him. I will be his, and with him I will remain. So he's saying, I will be loyal to David, to God's anointed king. But of course, Absalom hears him as referring to himself. And because the people have just declared him king. But what about the statement about the Lord? Absalom may be simply hearing it as a religious cliche. Well, if the people chose me, then hey, I'm God's choice. Just something that people say. But Absalom hears this. He's flattered by the statements. He likes it. And so he doesn't realize this is actually a statement of loyalty to David, the true king. So he just sucks it up. It's like, okay. But then he basically says, if David is no longer king, then it's only right to serve his son. Now, this is actually a true statement. This is actually a loyal statement. It would be a legitimate loyalty. Because in a dynasty, when a father finishes being king and his son takes the role of king, you shift your loyalty. And he says, so that's actually a true statement. He said, that makes sense. That's right. It would be a legitimate thing for me to serve you. I served your father, now I'll serve you. But then he concludes with this direct statement. As I served your father, I will serve you. Now here's the ironic thing about this statement. This is the only statement that would be clearly disloyal to David. As I served your father, now I'm serving you. But he's actually being loyal to David in making this statement. Why? Because this is exactly what David told him to say. Exactly. He said, go back to Absalom and say this. And so these are the exact words that David had told him. So all in all, Hushai is being perfectly loyal to David, but Absalom hears him as being loyal to him. And so even with Absalom's critical questioning, he pretty easily accepts Hushai as his advisor. Now, why does he do that? Well, the answer is quite simply because God is working here. God is working here and causing him. I mean, he had the question, why would you leave David? And we all would say, if you were so loyal to David, why would you be here now? We would all be suspicious of that. But he pretty quickly and easily accepts it because God is causing Hushai to be accepted so he can protect David. You see, at this point, things are totally out of David's hands. He is out of the city. He's far away. There's nothing he can do. And he sent his friend, his advisor, into a very precarious situation. Because if he were to be found out to be disloyal to Absalom, to be loyal to David, that's a dangerous place for him to be. Let me walk right up to the king, the supposed new king, who I'm opposing. And so he's put him in this very precarious position, and things are totally out of David's hands. But David is trusting God to do what's best and to do what's right. You see, when things are out of your hands, God is still working. When there's nothing you can do about it, it doesn't mean that there's nothing God can do about it. There is nothing that he can't handle. Let's keep reading. Chapter 16, verse 20. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, give your counsel. What shall we do? Ahithophel said to Absalom, go in to your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house. And all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now, so Absalom has accepted Hushai as an advisor, but he immediately turns to his most trusted advisor, who's been with him longer. He turns to Ahithophel and he says, what should I do? I'm in Jerusalem, I have the palace, now what should I do? And so Ahithophel gives him a quick answer. And his answer is both strategic and terrible. See, Ahithophel tells Absalom to go have sex with his father's concubines, his father's wives. Now, this would be strictly forbidden by the Old Testament. So why would he advise him to do this? Someone in Israel, why would you advise someone to do this? I mean, this is an immoral thing, and it was a highly offensive thing. So why would he do it? Well, because it's great. It has great effect. It would have a great effect. How? Well, first of all, it's a personal attack against David. It would show that Absalom is completely separated from his father and completely opposed to his father. So it's a clear statement of rebellion against the king. In other words, once you do this, there is no going back. So it's a statement, I am taking the throne. Secondly, it would build the morale of those who are following him and encourage them to keep following him. Now, how would it do that? Well, taking the king's wives, it was basically declaring dominance over the former king. Because you're saying, I'm taking your wives. I am taking what is yours and yours alone. I am taking what is most intimate to you, and you can do nothing about it. It's a power play. It's a statement of dominance. And so people would see this as a show of strength and want to follow him even more. This is Ahithophel's plan. So his reasoning, though, even though this is forbidden by God's law, his reason for doing it, it will rally the troops. But the question I have to ask is, what's more important? Being obedient to God or getting people excited to follow you? But how often is this the way that even Christians sometimes act? When we will choose something that is very pragmatic, something that is very strategic, rather than what we know is right. That we will do what we think will help us get ahead, that will be good for us, rather than what we know God would have us to do. Choose to honor God. So what Absalom did here was terrible. And it's a consequence of David's sin. You see, David took another man's wife. And now his son is taking his wives. You see, God told David through the prophet Nathan that this would happen. And he said, and it's going to happen publicly. He said, you did it privately, but this is going to happen to you publicly. And so now it's done. They set up a tent on the top of the palace where everybody could see the tent. And everyone could see Absalom walk into that tent with David's wives. It was done publicly. So this was not a surprise to God. He knew it would happen. But it also didn't stop God from working in David's life. When these people did this terrible thing, God was still working. When people are rebelling, God is still working. Look at verse 23. Now in those days the counsel of Ahithophel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed both by David and by Absalom. Now, this is just a small little comment here, but it sets up what's going to happen next. And this comment is about how well respected Ahithophel was for his great advice. In fact, both David and Absalom listened carefully to him. In fact, his advice here is compared to the word of God. In other words, getting advice from Ahithophel, they say it's kind of like getting direction from God. He says it's on that level. This was high praise. And it also meant that his advice held great sway over what happened in Israel. Well, let's keep reading what happened. Chapter 17, verse 1 says, "Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, 'Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged, and throw him into a panic, and all the people who are with him will flee. I will strike down only the king, and I will bring all the people back to you as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace.'" And so here this verse starts with the word "moreover." You see, Absalom had asked for advice. What do we do next? And first Ahithophel said, okay, you do this thing with your father's wives. Now he's giving him the second part. So the moreover, he's continuing his advice. And his advice is that you need to immediately gather an army of hand-picked men and go after David to kill him. But he says it in several things. First of all, he says you need to gather 12,000 men, which is an interesting number. That may suggest that there is a unit or 1,000 from each tribe in Jerusalem, in Israel, which would suggest that all of Israel's behind Absalom, supporting Absalom. But he tells them, gather these people and go after him tonight. This was actually very sound advice. I mean, he says, think about it, David had left suddenly, quickly. He had hurried to get away from town, to get away from Absalom. They would be tired and maybe unable to defend themselves, or at least not to defend themselves very well because they're exhausted. And so when the army would come upon them, they were overrun. Everyone will panic and they'll run, leaving David vulnerable. Now, there's one small problem with this plan here, and that's that he's assuming that everyone who's with David is willing to be disloyal and run away just like he was. That's not the case, but the timing of his plan is perfect. It's right. Attack them when they're exhausted. But then he also says, we will kill only David. He's saying that only David is your enemy, so let the rest of them go. Let the rest of them live and welcome them back home. You see, this would make Absalom look like he is benevolent and kind, and that he's good for Israel. Now, the bad thing about this is when Ahithophel says this, he's showing his own lack of reverence for God. Because he doesn't call David by name, but he calls him the king. Will kill only the king. David is the king, also known as the Lord's anointed. Do you remember when Saul was chasing David, how many times, over and over, David refused to lift a hand against the Lord's anointed. And he wouldn't let anyone else do it either. Even though Saul was seeking his life, he said, you're not going to hurt him. He's the Lord's anointed. He's the king. You see, to oppose the Lord's anointed was to oppose the Lord himself. So this rebellion is not only against men, but against God. Verse 4. And the advice seemed right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel. It was good advice. Verse 5, then Absalom said, call Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear what he has to say. Now this is amazing. Ahithophel gives his advice. Everyone agrees that this is a great plan. This is the right thing to do. But then for some reason, Absalom says, I want to know what Hushai thinks. Now, what's the reason? God. All right? Because at this point, you have this guy who you might be a little suspicious of, and you have this other guy who you totally trust, who gives great advice. You say, that's an awesome plan. Let's see what this guy thinks. It really doesn't make sense in a way, other than the fact that you know that God is working. So Absalom decides he needs another opinion. Now, granted, the next move he makes is an important move, and you need to make sure you're doing the right thing. But we just read an interesting verse a few minutes ago about how greatly esteemed Ahithophel was. And so, the guidance of the most respected advisor in Israel, the guy whose words were considered like the word of God, this time, his advice isn't enough. God is clearly in control and clearly working in this situation. He's answering David's prayer. Turn Ahithophel's wisdom into foolishness. God, help me. He's protecting David. Verse 6. And when Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom said to him, thus as Ahithophel spoken, shall we do as he says, if not speak? Now this is really interesting. Absalom just made it a whole lot easier for Hushai, because he told him exactly what Ahithophel had said. He didn't just say, what do you think we should do? And then weigh the two answers. He said, this is what Ahithophel says. Is it good, or should we do something different? And so he tells him he knows exactly where he has to start. All he has to do is tear apart his idea to give his own. Verse 7, then Hushai said to Absalom, this time the counsel of Ahithophel has given is not good. So that's interesting, because he recognizes that Ahithophel is a wise guy and that he gives good advice. But he says, but this time, it's not good. Verse 8, Hushai said, you know that your father and his men are mighty men, and that they are enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is an expert in war. He will not spend the night with the people. See, he's playing on the people's knowledge of David. What do we know about David? He is a mighty warrior. What about David's men? They are mighty warriors. And he says, and this time, they're angry. You've just taken their palace. You've taken his city. You're trying to take over his kingdom. Do you want to go face those mighty warriors when they're mad? He said, that's a bad idea. And then he says, and also David is wise. He knows, he's an expert. He will not spend the night with the people. Verse 9, behold, even now he has hidden himself in one of the pits or in some other place. As soon as some of the people fall, he says, David isn't going to stick around for you just to find him. You're not going to just walk up to the group and say, oh, there he is. We can just kill David. He says, you're going to have to fight just to find him. He's hidden somewhere. He says, and as soon as some of the people fall at the first attack, whoever hears it will say, there has been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. Then even the valiant men whose heart is like the heart of a lion will utterly melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and that those who are with him are valiant men. See, he says, as soon as we start taking losses, people are going to all of a sudden recognize who they're fighting against. What are we doing here? Why are we doing this? This is crazy. And he says, and they will lose their courage and run away. He said, that's a bad idea to attack David and his men like that. So Hushai basically accuses Ahithophel of underestimating the military prowess of David and his men. Continue on in verse 11. It says, but my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you, from Dan to Beersheba, as the sand by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. So we shall come upon him in some place where he is to be found, and we shall light upon him as the dew falls on the ground, and of him and to all the men with him not one will be left. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we shall drag it into the valley. Not even a pebble is to be found there. He's saying, we can just tear down that wall. We'll have so many people. He's saying, you need to gather all these people, a huge army, to overtake him because they're such mighty warriors. But this is basically a stall tactic, because it takes time to gather that big army. It'll take a few days to gather people from all over Israel. So it's a stall tactic to give David more time. Time to rest. Time to get onto the other side of the river into a better position. Time to be ready for battle. But notice how he played to Absalom's arrogance. You see, in Ahithophel's advice, it was, let me gather together an army and I will take them and we'll kill David. When Hushai says, let the army be gathered to you, everyone following Absalom. And he says, and you go into battle in person. This is your moment to shine, Absalom. You get to be the star. You lead the army. You win. Look what they thought. Verse 14. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. So now they all agree with Hushai. How did he persuade them? I mean, Ahithophel's advice was actually better. How did he persuade them? I mean, maybe he played on Absalom's arrogance and the people's played on the people's fears of David's military reputation. But the way he persuaded them was God. In fact, we're told this. And this verse contains the central statement of this entire passage and tells us how we should read this entire passage. In 14, the second half of verse 14, it says, for the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. You see, God is working here. The odds are stacked against David and his men. The odds are stacked against Hushai and his advice. But this was not a problem for God. You see, when the task seems impossible, God is still working. Verse 15. Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar the priest, thus and so did Ahithophel counsel Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so have I counseled. Now you'll remember, David had sent the priests back to Jerusalem, and his sons were to be like messengers. So they were to hear what the plan was, what was happening, and they were to run to David to tell him what was going on. So Hushai is now reporting to the priests so they can get the message to their sons, so they can get the message to David. Verse 16, now therefore send quickly and tell David, do not stay tonight at the fords of the wilderness, but by all means pass over, lest the king and all the people who are with him be swallowed up. So he says, you need to give him the message to move across the river, to get to a better, safer place, more defensible location. Verse 17, now Jonathan and Ahimaaz, that's the priest's sons, were waiting in Rogel. A female servant was to go and tell them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they were not to be seen entering the city. So apparently they said, we got to stay outside of town, because if they see us coming and going, it will raise suspicion. And so they're hiding outside of town, and someone was to take the message to them. Verse 18, but a young man saw them and told Absalom. They were doing their best, but they were found out anyways. So both of them went away quickly and came to the house of a man at Bahurim, who had a well in his courtyard, and they went down into it. So they climbed down into the well. Verse 19, and the woman took and spread a covering over the well's mouth and scattered grain on it, and nothing was known of it. Now this was a common thing. You would cover up the well and use it like a table. And you spread the grain on it so it could dry. And so this was a normal thing that wouldn't be suspicious at all. Verse 20, when Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house, they said, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" And the woman said to them, "They have gone over the brook of water." And when they had sought and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. So she basically said, oh, they've already left. And so they go to look for them. They can't find them. They go back to Jerusalem. Verse 21, after they had gone, the men came up out of the well and went and told King David. They said to David, "Arise and go quickly over the water, for thus and so has Ahithophel counseled against you." Then David arose and all the people who were with him, and they crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. And so he says, we got to get out of town. We got to get on the other side into this safer place. And they all go before morning. In verse 23, it says, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and went off home to his own city. He set his house in order and hanged himself. And he died and was buried in the tomb of his fathers. Now, we could read this here, that Ahithophel is just having a pity party. And I think that might be part of what's going on. But, like he's like, I wasn't listened to, maybe I'm not so important anymore. But there's much more going on here. You see, Ahithophel is wise. He's smart. And he knows what's going to happen. He knows that what's going to be the result of Hushai's plan. He knows that David is going to win. David is going to survive because of this delay. I mean, you just let this great warrior set up and get ready for the attack. He knows what's going to happen. And Absalom has now lost his advantage. And so he's going to lose. So David will return as the king, and then those treasonous people will be dealt with. And that would include Ahithophel. And so Ahithophel calmly goes home. It's like he just slips out of town. He calmly goes home. He sets his house in order. In other words, does whatever he needs to do to make sure his inheritance and everything's in place. And he kills himself. You see, the sad thing is he chose to oppose God. Choosing to oppose God is a bad idea. And now he will no longer advise kings or rebels. But I want to talk again about the priest's sons for a second. Their whole situation, running out of town, hiding in a well, the woman covering it with some grain. Then the guys come, where are they at? They run and they can't find them and return home. Then they crawl out of the well and they go on their way. To remind you of another situation, it's very reminiscent of when the spies went to Jericho and Rahab hid them. There's a lot of common things that happen, very similar things that happen. But the greatest similarity in both of them is that God is protecting his people. God is causing things to work in their favor. You see, when you face danger, God is still working. And the best place to be is close to God. Verse 24 says, then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Now Absalom had set Amasa over the army instead of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra, the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So they're related. Verse 26, and Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, the son of Amiel from Lodabar, and Barzillai, the Gilead from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, and earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds, and sheep and cheese from the herd, for David and the people with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. And so after David crosses the river, he continues traveling up to Mahanaim. This is the city where Saul's son Ishbosheth lived while he was being king over Israel for that short time when Abner, the leader of the military, was supporting him. This is where he was living. So this is a defensible location. And Absalom and the army, they also cross over the river ready for battle. He has a new commander because Joab went with David. But after David arrives there in that city in Mahanaim, 3 different men bring him food and supplies. Now here's the interesting thing. One is a foreigner. And one of them is Machir, who was the man who Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, Saul's grandson, was living with before David brought him to Jerusalem to live. And so this is a guy who was a supporter of Saul. And so you got these men who are bringing things to David, but they came to the aid of God's chosen king. They came to the aid of the legitimate king. These are people who respect and support David. These are people who are faithful to God's king, even though Absalom is coming and they would be risking their lives to help David. They're willing to do it. And these men stand in contrast to those who are rebelling against God and against his king. And God is using these people to support, to provide for his servant. You see, when you lack resources, God doesn't. When you lack resources, God is still working. Now, I've said over and over this morning, God is working. And as you can see from David's life, as you can see, that doesn't mean that you will never face hardship. Through many of these things, they are hardships, but God is working. It doesn't mean you will never face danger, but God will continue to work in your life and through those things. I also don't want you to think that what I mean is that everything will always turn out just the way you want it to in the end. In what we saw today, things are working in David's favor. And we will see that things do turn out fairly well for David, but not everything. There's a well-known but often misused verse in Romans. It's Romans 8:28, and it's very fitting to this subject. Very fitting here. God is working. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose." Now, this verse here does not mean that everything in your life will be good or that it will all work out just how you want it to in the end. But what it does mean is that God is working in your life and in the world to fulfill his purpose. And his purpose for your life is that you would be holy. His purpose for your life is that you would become like Jesus. In fact, the next verse in Romans says that he has predestined you to be conformed to the image of his Son. And that is what's good. That is good. So in every circumstance, whether good or bad, easy or hard, safe or risky, when you have got things handled or when things are totally out of your hands, nothing you can do about it. Whether you have plenty or whether you lack resources, and no matter what other people are doing, in every circumstance, God is working.